Before I start, I want to offer a couple of observations about my short time here on campus and with this group. First off, bike riders are a lot like horses. You don't really know what they're going to do, and they tend to run in herds on this campus, I've noticed. Secondly, adaptive management is a lot like Western rivers. It starts with high expectations. It flows downstream and hits rapids and all kinds of boulders and obstructions. And unless you're below a Bureau reclamation dam, it does continue to flow downstream and gain from tributaries and input. And the input in our case, from our collected case here in this room, is the knowledge and the education that we're getting from dialoguing with each other. So what I was asked to talk about as we start here today a bit is my perspectives on a couple of issues. Let's see if we can get this, on where I come from on this issue of adaptive management and regulations and how they interact with each other. First off, my academic training is as a scientist and engineer. So to the students who are still in the room, Jay, if there's any of your folks still here, it's really important you guys get the basics of scientific thought process down. It's critical to the long-term aspects of your career. Secondly, you're shaped by those that you come in contact with, whether they're people in conferences like this, whether they're your academic instructors, or whatever. You're going to be shaped by the people you come in contact with, and you need to learn from that. Thirdly, is you learn by doing. The whole concept of adaptive management, and often under fire. And I challenge any of you here to try to explain the concept of adaptive management to the former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, after he's 3 sheets to the wind and he's more interested in his entourage and his Harley Davidson. But that was part of the deal. You had to be able to interact and try to explain concepts that to us, we can at least spell it, but something like that internally within politics is hard. And now in my life, this part of my life, I'm trying to figure out what the next chapter is. So it's always a challenge, and it should always be a challenge for folks. I noticed yesterday that in the discussion we had, all the examples were primarily from estuaries. And that's good, because that's what you're talking about here with the San Francisco Bay Delta experience. Back in the early 80s, we began a process in the Colorado River, specifically at Glen Canyon Dam, where we started to implore the elements of adaptive management. We didn't know what to call it at that point, but that's what it was. 82, the Secretary of Interior, particularly sensitive Secretary of Interior, Jim Watt, who was getting sued, who said we need to do something with the operations of Glen Canyon Dam. Let's throw some money at science. They will never come up with a conclusion, and we can continue operations as we go. You can see the timeline there. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through it, but there's a couple important elements of this. First off, in 1985, at the request, again, of the Secretary of Interior, who had just thrown $200,000 to the National Academy of Sciences to stand up what was called the Water Science and Technology Board, called up and said, do you have anything we can have these people do? It was probably one of the smartest decisions I ever made in operating and managing the Glen Canyon studies, because we brought science, high-level science review in at a very early stage. It was hard, it was nasty. We hadn't been doing really good science, but the Academy made us become better scientists in the peer review continual process of moving through it. The second thing that I want to point out from this list of dates up here is the importance of dialoguing with your stakeholders. Early on, we had a very select group of stakeholders. They were the water districts, they were the water people who bought the power out of Glen Canyon Dam, and they were some of the boaters in the Grand Canyon who didn't have a very vocal voice at that time, but they became very vocal because they had this unique platform. When you take a Grand Canyon trip, you've got people on your boat for anywhere from 7 to 21 days, and they could instill in people's minds the importance of what was happening with the operation of the dam. Those people, every guide that I knew in the Grand Canyon, had postcards in his box on his boat that he would give his clients, his passengers, and they would write letters. They would send postcards into Congress. That's what got Congress engaged in this. And the last thing, before I'll move on here, is getting the political folks engaged in this. I was able to get Congressman George Miller and Senator John McCain and a few others interested in the Grand Canyon, and that went a long way to helping us along. So some threads from yesterday. Science is an investment. Science is advancing knowledge, not just collecting data. And a lot of times we go out there and collect data just to collect data, but we really have to use that to advance the science. Stakeholder and their involvement is critical. Not all stakeholders are created equal, and I put traditional environmental ecological knowledge up there, TEK. Dealing with the tribes, and we had 8 Native American tribes who were engaged, who had societal regards to the Grand Canyon. You have to deal with the tribes in a whole different level than you deal with your other stakeholders. You have to spend time at the chapter houses. You have to spend time with the leaders educating them on the process. The role of the federal agencies is different. Federal regulatory agencies is different from federal data agencies. So a regulatory agency has a whole different set of requirements and how they do business versus a federal agency who just is in the business of collecting data. So it's important to realize that. Managing uncertainty and risk is an ongoing effort for all of us. Developing a common language is important. You have to have some common terminology that you're consistent with as you explain your process. And third, open dialogue and the sharing of data is critical. I'm not going to spend much time on this. We talked a lot about this, and if you look at all the examples from yesterday, there are kind of 4 areas where they all plop out in: scientific, managerial, cultural, or political. They're very important that you recognize all of them. Regulations and adaptive management. First off, you have to determine the relationship of the regulations and policy to the issues. Is it guidance? Is it therefore restrictions, i.e. some of the Endangered Species Act issues related to species, or is it process directed? So it's important to understand what that regulation is and what its potential impacts may be on your particular process or studies. Understand what the limits and sideboards are. Educate the regulators and the stakeholders continuously. It's important you have a dialogue with agencies like the Fish and Wildlife Service or National Marine Fisheries Service or the Corps of Engineers or EPA so that they understand the challenges you're facing. I have found from my experience that the more dialogue that you do with both the regulatory side and with the stakeholder side, you can get a common understanding of where the challenges are. And lastly, I want to put on there is determine where the points are when lack of action will potentially lead to litigation. Everybody needs to know where that threshold is. Is it the loss of a certain number of beaches in the Grand Canyon? Is it the numbers of Chinook salmon fry that are coming through? You have to know where your thresholds are so you can work through them and understand them. Challenges with federal agencies. I throw this up here because in my former role in the House of Representatives, I got this all the time and had members of Congress ask me, why can't you just solve this problem? Well, one of the things is we have 26 federal agencies who have water in their mission statements. Think about that, 26 silos that are out there. Each of them have their own directive, have their own funding base, and there are a very limited number of bridges that exist between those 26 silos. Part of the job is trying to figure out how to get people to share. The challenges of getting both authorizing legislation, which a WRDA bill, Water Resource Development Act bill, is, versus getting an appropriation legislation, which is actually the money. We can do all kinds of WRDA bills, but if you don't have appropriations following up behind it, it's just a lot of words on paper. FACA requirement, we've talked about that, and Nick did a good job of explaining the importance of getting FACA exemptions if you can in your process. Permits for streamlining agency cultures, I don't want to miss that. Agency cultures must be understood. Dealing with the Corps of Engineers and the way they think is different than dealing with the Bureau of Reclamation and how they think versus dealing with the Fish and Wildlife Service and how they think. The primary example I can say is when I was in the House, I was responsible for coordinating the Hill responsibility to Hurricane Sandy response. We had an issue up on Long Island where Hurricane Sandy had directly impacted a significant number of people. Hurricane had come through, it had breached a couple of the outer dunes on Long Island, Fire Island National Seashore area, and we were trying to get out there to protect the people, get the dunes rebuilt. Park Service said, well, it's a wilderness area, folks. Can't take any piece of equipment in there to rebuild the dune. The congressman from Long Island said, I've got people, I've got 50,000 Poor people, these are the service people to all those Wall Streeters who live on Long Island, who live there, and they are directly exposed to if we get a next storm. Versus the Fish and Wildlife Service, who said, well, we have plover and we have some endangered plants. So the point here is each of those cultures, you have to understand how they operate and work. Permits for streamlining difficult issues is hard, but it's not impossible. So you can do it. Pooling budgets with the agencies is a real challenge because of OMB. And there's no other way to get around it. We've got to do a better job of educating OMB and changing some of their philosophy. Knowing when to engage the public process with the federal agencies is critical. In WRDA 2014, we laid out a new process for how projects are proposed and move forward. It's totally different. The no earmark ban in Washington, D.C. totally changed the way projects are initiated. So the point here is that congressional cycles come and flow. They go in 2 years, 4 years, 6-year cycles, and you have to know where those windows of opportunities are. In the interest of time, I want to just quickly get a couple of things here. First off, in the 114th Congress alone, this is the present Congress we're in, there are 28 pieces of legislation that have adaptive management. In the legislation, 28 pieces of legislation. Think about that. I can guarantee you go to talk to the staff who wrote that legislation, they're not going to have clue one what it really means. So again, it's important for us to communicate on these issues. Second off, NEPA and ESA often include forms of adaptive management in them. And that can either be in the records of decision or the reasonable and prudent alternatives. It's there. We have to do a better job of explaining what it is, but it can be done. Thirdly, in the 2009 and 2010, we had the Congressional Research Service, or I had them, look at all the various programs that are federally funded out there to do a review of adaptive management. They did that. It's been very effective in helping to educate the public. And then lastly, kind of 5 elements emerge out of this, and in the interest of time, I'm going to just quickly roll through them. The leadership of adaptive management initiatives is critical at all levels. Stakeholder representation and involvement and support is important. Clear and concise decision rules need to be articulated right from the very beginning. We've heard this over and over from every one of the presenters. The importance of milestones and objectives, articulating those again so people know when they're going to be reaching thresholds or reporting results. And lastly, the balancing of flexibility and certainty, managing expectations and abilities. Again, I just want to get to the last piece here. Some personal observations. First off, leadership is critical. You have to build this leadership. You have to nurture it. You have to mentor it. You have to make sure that they understand the process and protect you. Stakeholders have a limited capacity to how much science they can handle without results. So again, you've kind of got to feed them along the way and show them some positive or negative results, as the case may be, from what the science is producing. You must have an entrepreneurial mindset. In my opinion, a traditional agency manager put into spooling up and running an adaptive management program is doomed to fail if they're not understanding that they have to be willing to think on their feet. They can't just depend upon checking the box. Every program has to have some folks who always are thinking kind of outside the box. They're always challenging you to what you do. People who get the program to the adaptive management door are likely not the people who are going to carry it forward. And I say this from the entrepreneurial piece, and I say this from once adaptive management gets ingrained into an agency. And I'll use the example of the Grand Canyon Monitoring and Research Center, which came after we got done with our Glen Canyon program, is that they have a whole new set of bureaucracy, a whole new set of ways they do business, a whole new set of how they get their dollars, their finances, in order to run the program. So it's just, you just kind of keep that in the back of your mind, that you have different sets of people and their mindsets on how they do it. Periodic independent review is critical. I've already articulated that. The smartest thing you can do is have independent review come in and periodically assess what you're doing. People who don't have a dog in the fight, but who are willing to tell you what you may not want to hear, but need to hear. No science program is sacred. I had a lot of folks from the agencies when we started the Glen Canyon study say, well, we've been doing this for 20 years. We've been collecting fish this way or doing electrofishing this way. You know, it might have worked great for 20 years, and you should look at what you can carry forward but no science program is on its own sacred. You have to look at how that science is done over time. And lastly, I like to think of adaptive management in terms of modules. There's only so much you can market or sell to an administrator or a decision maker or a politician on the first go around. You build in modules, and you continue to build in modules as you go down the road. So I've taken your time, and I know you want to move on, so I will end it there.